was a beautiful African seamstress. She was called a mulatto, and so was I. We were called a mulatto when one of your parents was African or Indian and the other was European. Name calling was used to separate and divide people from each other. It might sound crazy, but I'm telling you the truth. Besides being called mulattoes, we were also called dower slaves. Dower slaves meant that we were the property of the wife passed by her husband after his death. I was considered the property of Mrs. Martha Washington's first husband's estate, Daniel Park Custis. But I am a child of God. I never considered myself nobody's property. My father and my mother lived and worked on Mr. George and Mrs. Martha Washington's plantation in Mount Vernon, Virginia. To control enslaved Africans in Virginia, slave codes were passed that gave the so-called slave owners unlimited power. For example, slave owners would not be taken to court for, quote, casual killing of slaves, end quote. Slave codes were strictly enforced. The lawmakers started calling Africans blacks and calling Europeans whites. Reference to slavery entered into Virginia law as early as 1661. It became illegal for blacks and whites to get married. President Washington never acknowledged me as being the child of my father because he was considered white. A slave code was passed in Virginia around 1662 that stated children would follow the status of their mothers. By law, I followed the status of my mother. My dear mother was forced to serve the President and Mrs. Washington for her entire life. My mother and every child that she birthed would never be free. But since I can remember, I always wanted my freedom. The so-called slave codes were used to justify our enslavement and treat us different from the whites like we were less than human. My English father had the status of an indentured servant. He was required to work for the Washingtons, but only for a certain amount of time. Once he satisfied his contract, he was free. You might not believe it, but back in those days, white folks involved in slavery thought it was black folks' natural place to wait on them hand and foot and be their slaves. But I ain't no slave. I never was. When I was a little girl, I was very smart. Miss Martha said that I was a quick learner. My mother taught me to be very polite. Miss Martha noticed and decided to make me her attendant when I was about 10 years old. I was assigned to work directly for Miss Martha. They took me from the slave quarters into the mansion at Mount Vernon. Most of the time, I was very busy with my chores. Sometimes, I got to keep company with Miss Martha's granddaughter, Nellie Custis. I enjoyed my time with Nellie. Still, I was unhappy. She was free, but I was not. Just like my mother, I was good with my hands and liked to sew. She taught me how to do needlework. I became quite good at it. Some people called me an expert. I didn't care about being no expert. I wanted my freedom. Miss Martha was quite fond of me, so people said. She chose me to be her body servant when Mr. Washington was elected president on April 14, 1789. I was responsible for the care of Miss Martha's clothes and hair. I was about 16 years old by this time. Some of the enslaved Africans envied my position. They whispered that they would be delighted to serve Miss Martha. But I didn't care about my position. I wanted something more. I wanted my freedom. In April 1789, the president and Miss Martha took me and 7 other enslaved Africans up north to New York City. Maul, Hercules, Richmond, Giles, Paris, Christopher Sheets, my brother Alston, and me were chosen to serve the Washingtons at their new presidential residence. I had heard about the North. There was a lot of coded language and passing of information among enslaved Africans. On the Mount Vernon plantation, Sambo Anderson lived with us. They called him a saltwater Negro because he came straight from Africa. He had beautiful markings on his face that identified what nation he came from. He used to tell us stories about Africa. Those of us who had African blood were proud of it. We all wanted our freedom. During my travels in the North, all I could think about was my freedom. About November 1790, the Washingtons moved from New York City to Philadelphia, the new capital. They decided to take us with them instead of sending us back to Mount Vernon. We stayed at 190 High Street. Some people thought I had it pretty good for an enslaved woman. Miss Martha took me with her on shopping trips and on social visits. She bought me things too. None of this really mattered to me. I did not want anything except my freedom. Philadelphia was called the city of brotherly love. It was very different from Virginia and even New York. The state of Pennsylvania passed a law that stated enslaved Africans who resided in the state for 6 months became free. President Washington used to send some of the enslaved Africans back and forth between Pennsylvania and Virginia so he didn't lose control of any of his valuable enslaved Africans. There was lots of excitement in Philadelphia. They had an abolitionist movement going on. Abolitionists were both black and white, male and female. They protested against slavery. When I found out, my heart raced. I knew that I was in the right place to talk about my freedom. The free black community in Philadelphia had many prominent people like Sarah and Richard Allen, Mary and Absalom Jones, James Dexter, and James Fortin. There were so many beautiful blacks, I cannot recall them all. They even had an organization called the Free African Society. Learning all of this gave me a sense of pride and a determination to get free. I secretly made friends with some free blacks. They were very dignified, spiritual people. They did not take their freedom for granted. More importantly, they were very nice to me. I told them that I wanted my freedom. They assured me that they would help me get my freedom. They helped me plan my escape. They were wonderful. From that moment, I loved every one of them for the rest of my life. I could taste my freedom. In 1796, the Washingtons planned to travel back to Virginia. Quote, whilst they were packing up to go to Virginia, I was packing to go, I didn't know where, for I knew if I went back to Virginia, I could never get my liberty, end quote. I escaped one night in May 1796 when the president and Miss Martha were eating their dinner. My friends gave me some blankets to keep me warm. I disguised myself as a woman much heavier than I really was. They put me on a merchant ship named Nancy heading further north. The ship was commanded by Captain Jack Bowles of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I was very scared. I knew that if I got caught, the punishment would be horrible. I was terrified by the thought of being whipped, but my thoughts of freedom were greater than any fear of the consequences. I was concealed in the hull of the ship for the entire trip, for about 4 or 5 days. I was wrapped up in blankets, but was still very cold. I could not tell if it was day or night. The trip was rocky. I got sick. I wasn't sure if my sickness came from the excitement of getting closer to my freedom or the rocking of the ship. At times, I felt like I was going to faint, but a voice inside said, "Hold on, Oney, freedom is near." I finally arrived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. That's where I claimed my freedom. I was still at risk because slavery was considered legal in New Hampshire. It was a very dangerous situation. Slavery did not end in New Hampshire until 1857. Through God's grace and the help of my angels, I was able to take my precious freedom. I tasted the sweet air around me and shouted, "Hallelujah." That was the joy of my life, my freedom. My new friends took good care of me. There was an African community in Portsmouth with people like Coffee Whipple. Mr. Whipple was the brother of Prince Whipple, an African Revolutionary War veteran. More than 5,000 Africans served in the Revolutionary War. I was discovered by a friend of the Washingtons in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Later, I learned that Miss Martha was very upset. She could not believe that I left her like I did. She thought that I had been kidnapped or charmed away by a Frenchman. She told people she was very good to me. That did not matter to me. She still thought I was her property. I ain't nobody's property. God made me to be free. There's nothing like freedom. Miss Martha demanded that the president get me back. President Washington had signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 before I escaped. I was residing in the president's house in Philadelphia when he signed it. The shame of it all. The same place where I heard the president and other founding fathers talk about freedom. The law made it a crime for enslaved Africans to take their freedom. The law also made it a crime for people to help us, to hide us, or to prevent our arrest. The law did not stop me. It made me want my freedom even more. God knows I miss my mother, my brother, and other family members. But as an enslaved girl, I spent most of my time away from my family anyway. I had to tend to Miss Martha. There was no going back for me. For the rest of my natural life, I had to protect myself from slave catchers. I did not care. I was free. After I was cited by the Washington's friend, word got back to them I was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Several attempts were made to get me back to the Washingtons. President Washington wrote a letter to his Treasury Secretary, Oliver Wolcott. He wrote this about me, quote, "The ingrate of the girl who was brought up and treated more like a child than a servant, and Mrs. Martha desires to recover her, ought not to escape with impunity if it can be avoided," end quote. President Washington and Miss Martha were shocked when they